Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I'm not only really excited for this program and to hear what these brilliant people have to say to us and discuss with us tonight, but also really proud to be doing something in partnership with Gray Area Foundation, which has been doing such great work in the Bay Area with kind of forward-looking, innovative, outside-of-the-box projects and artists. But I am going to ask a question, and I asked this question a month ago when we did this program or a version of it at the Battery in San Francisco, and one person raised their hand, so I'm kind of curious if anything has changed in the last 30 days. Has anybody heard of Riz? Okay, wait, keep the hands up. How many? Riz? Oh, interesting. Well, it's a little more market penetration. There's like 3 or 4 hands. Riz is short for charisma, and I'll read you what Carolyn Bachia said in Medium about Riz. It's an AI dating platform that crafts witty responses to potential love interests so you don't have to think or feel or weep for humanity. And it's, you know, it's kind of outrageous, right? But there's a lot of outrageous things going on in our world these days, and some of them have to do with AI. And it's not a far leap from that, from the Riz platform, to a discussion of art and AI, because courtship and witticisms is the sort of thing that we think of as being in the human domain. And maybe a lot of us want to keep it in the human domain. It's sort of annoying to think that maybe robots will start doing that. And in fact, maybe robots will start flirting with robots. People will say, "Did you meet online?" And you'll say, "I actually don't know." You know, there's like, it could get really weird, and it is. But, you know, art is one of these things too that is and has been in the human domain. And a lot of what we love about art is its humanity. And so we're here today to talk about machines and machine intelligence and this long tradition of machines and mechanisms and technology being part of the artist's world, because we can't pretend that's new. People use cameras, and they use palette knives, and they use paint brushes, and they use paint, and, you know, technology is part of how we kind of make ourselves known. But there are some next level things happening. So with that, I think I'd like to introduce Vanessa Chang, who's here on this side of the panel. Vanessa Chang is Director of Programs at Leonardo. She has a PhD in Modern Thought and Literature from Stanford. She served for several years on the board of Immersive Arts Alliance. So please welcome Vanessa Chang and our panel.
Thank you for the introduction, Clark, and yeah, delighted to be here with you all. And we had a version of this conversation about a month ago, which I think took a lot of surprising, some hopeful, some, I wouldn't say apocalyptic, but some less than hopeful turns. So I'm looking forward to kind of exploring those nuances with you a little bit further. I'm a curator, a writer, and a researcher. Working in art, science, and technology, and I've seen a lot of work over the last few years in art and AI, and the explosion onto the kind of into the mainstream commercial art world has been really fascinating to watch. So let's think more tonight about what AI can do through the discussion practices of these 3 leaders in the field. The way we'll organize this conversation is I will invite each of them to briefly talk about their practice and their work for about 5 minutes. After each has had a chance to do that, we'll start pulling some of those strands together, explore what some of the affordances of AI are as a medium, and then think more about where that might take us from there. So with that, I'd like to begin with Evo. So Evo Heyning is a creator, producer, co-founder, and technologist working at the intersection of open source infrastructure, network media, and interoperability for an open metaverse. She's the author of Promptcraft Guidebook and the upcoming book and game RealityCraft, serves also as the vice president of xrguild.org. Evo, would you like to tell us a bit about your work in art and AI, and what your experience is, and how, what some examples, how it works?
Absolutely, and thank you. Thank you to everyone at Gray Area for having us here tonight, and thank you, Vanessa. As Vanessa mentioned, I wrote a book maybe this was February 1, that prompt craft came out. But this comes from 20 years of experimentation in not just AI, but collective intelligence and how it informs our creative life. So that includes all types of creatives, whether you're a visual artist, whether you're a writer, videographer, a musician, and we're going to explore some of that in this quick talk. So go ahead, next slide. So for the last year, I've been working in tools like Midjourney, and next slide, and you're going to see some of that work here. Now, over the last year, I've made about 60,000 images in Midjourney, another 10,000 in various Stable Diffusion versions. I typically will test somewhere between 5 and 10 tools a week, both for commissions and for clients, but also just for my own art and creativity. This is actually a music video, and I don't think we're going to play the video here, but I formed a band after exploring all of the different modalities in music and video and art. A friend of mine named Will Henshaw down in LA came to me and said, what do you think about making some music together? And so we took my art and the videos, we went to 15 different large language models, so ChatGPT-4 and many other what we call LLMs, and I began writing lyrics for an album with these tools. And my co-writer, Will, he wrote all the music, and then we began using a tool called 11 Labs for what we call the ciphers, which are the voices on the album. Now, the ciphers are humans who have then been trained as an algorithmic voice that we use to then deliver the music. And we can deliver it a million different ways and then recut that for the music. So we're in final mastery now. The first music video is up. It's at Oracles, which is AURICLES. AI on YouTube, and oracles is the word for the ear. If you have not heard that word before, it is also the atrium of the heart. So just a little nerdy bit for you. Next. So as I mentioned, I do a lot of work both in nonprofit and in commission work that is designed to solve a problem, maybe a social impact issue. This is work that was done post-radiation cleanup and being able to think forward about what happens after radiation work. Next slide, please. And often I'm also thinking about how to use these tools for things like fine art or interactive art or impossible art. So for example, I love labradorite and stone. I'm a sculptor, I'm a glass artist. Many of the things I try to design in Midjourney would be very difficult or impossible to do in physical space, such as doing large labradorite sculpture. Next slide. Where this comes together with media creation is world building. So many of my clients today are storytellers, filmmakers, writers, creators, and the work that we're doing is the same work that has been happening in storytelling throughout, but we are sometimes supercharging it in the sense of helping teams go through the process of creating every little detail for their world and then building that forward so that it can be in a film, in a video game, or in some other story. Next slide. This looks like lots of different things. So these are design ideas for futuristic kitchens because I like to design things and I want a futuristic kitchen. Next slide. This plays out in lots of different forms though. So many of the types of both portraiture, animation, next slide as well, you can just flip through these pretty fast. A lot of the worlds and design motifs I'm working toward are designed to help us appreciate what we love about each other. So less about technology, more about biophilia and what it means to be most beautifully human. Next slide. Sometimes this means designing new spaces. So this is a prototype for an XR Guild library, and this will be a WebXR space where you can go and receive the last 25 years of research into immersive art. So this is something that we are working on where Midjourney is informing a process that is now moving into XR development. Next slide. So if you're looking for the book really goes forward into the various types of media and how to get started. It is probably too simple for some of you here who have been experimenting in this space longer, but I am putting out a new version that will go into, for example, the experiments with many large language models and many of the tools now coming out in video, world building, and multimodal. And so if you want to check out the band, I would love for you to come and listen. Just the first single went out on YouTube last night. We are planning to drop a new single every 2 weeks this summer. And my bandmate Will, he comes from a band called London Beat previously. So you might have heard his music. He's very dancey. And figuring out how to get AI to dance with us has been really fun. There's an experimentation that's happening where we're starting to learn how to dance together in this sort of symbiosis. And so that's part of what I'm here to explore with us today. That's me. If you want to find me, evo.ist, and my handles, I'm at Reality Craft. My studio and design lab is in Oakland.
Thank you, Evo. So much to follow through there. Next, I'd like to invite Bogdana, Bobi, Rakova, who's a computer scientist, machine learning engineer, and researcher now working at the intersection of science and technology studies and computational law. Bobi is a senior trustworthy AI fellow at Mozilla, working on reimagining consent and contestability in AI. Bobi, please tell us about what you've been working on.
Thank you, and thank you, Evo and Gray Area again. And I think you heard beautifully Evo speaking about this artistic arc that you have in your work, and I guess I'm bringing in way more of, here's a machine learning engineer who has been curious about art and way more about how these tools are enabling more people to participate in this work. And I started out with working in machine learning engineering and got interested in how these models have incredible impact of the way people interact with technology and interact with each other, interact with public services, right? The way that technology really impacts our lives. And I then studied with Berkman Klein Center at Harvard Law School. They had a program called Ethics and Governance of AI, which really looked into engaging with policy and law experts into what are some of the risks and challenges of AI. And then I got into this field called AI auditing, which is really about mapping potential failure modes with AI. And this really inspired a lot of this work around how do we really think about AI systems and how they work and don't work for people. And next slide. This is where I am now going to talk to you about terms of service agreements, as something that I'm sure all of us interface with. And I know it's not as exciting, but this is exactly where I think there's a lot of, right now, interesting conversation happening around, okay, like how are we think about liability? How are we think about our data, right? How are we think about consent? And really, what are the ways that technology companies are now normalizing new ways of how we think about our data and our human agency and our work as artists, as creators in so many different mediums. Next slide, please. And then with generative AI in particular, right, we're talking about these language models that Evo was mentioning and models that are generating images, they're generating speech and all of these mediums. And what is missing, right? We're seeing a tremendous amount of work from communities that are doing auditing and these community-driven audits and evaluations of these AI systems. And in particular with artwork, I really want to highlight the work of Sanativa AI, who are right there, and they're a team that just won a Mozilla competition yesterday. They can wave, and really I applauded work in watermarking, like how do we create watermarks that can help artists in really safeguarding what happens to their work and prevent it from being used for AI models that are as training data, right? And this is really where I think we also can look into this sort of innovation on the contractual level, such that we could really encompass sort of the life cycle of how data is used in the machine learning pipeline and ensure what happens in that life cycle. So next slide. Yes, so there's really a need to recognize, acknowledge what is being normalized with technology, because what is not missing, next slide please, is definitely hype. So there is a lot of hype. So next slide please, but that is really only sort of the tip of the iceberg, right? Like bringing here really learnings from systems thinking and this work called leverage points in a system, how to intervene in a system, places to intervene in a system by Donello Meadows, who really kind of decomposes the complexity behind complex systems, right? And with AI technology and the way it is used in society, right, there's a lot of complexity and sort of underlying patterns in which it impacts the way we interact among each other. Next slide, please. And this is where this main project that I'm doing in collaboration with Renee Shelby, who's also here, hi Renee, and Megan Ma, who's the assistant director with Stanford's Codex Center for Legal Linguistics and Computational Linguistics. We're particularly looking at the terms of service agreement and other sort of cookie policies, content policies, other kinds of agreements as an intervention point, where we are introducing a feminist science and technology studies framework that really sort of engages with what are we agreeing to, and also bring in computational elements to these agreements that can help us in real time evaluate how are we kind of where the agreement might be broken, right? Like where something goes wrong, like being able to give people more agency over how their data is misused or used by bad actors, right? Like used against their will, right? In some way or the other. Next slide, please. So the framework is really framed in these notions of contestability in terms of how are people able to challenge algorithmic outcomes of these AI systems, co-constitutions in terms of participation in the user agreements that we end up signing by using these systems, addressing friction in terms of the productive resolution of conflict that might happen between algorithmic and human actors, and of course also like bad actors that are using our data in certain ways within these models. The notion of informed refusal, then I'm going to speak more about just in a little bit, and disclosure center mediation, which talks about the disclosure that there's AI being used and leveraging from the field of medical law to think about alternative dispute resolution in the context of harm or risks of AI. Next slide, please. And now really narrowing down into contestability as the set of mechanisms for people to disagree, challenge, or dispute algorithmic decisions. And here, really creating more ways to for people to challenge the way that the AI is kind of giving a certain kind of outcome and have more granularity over the potential risks or harms or injustice that might happen, which is really grounded in a taxonomy of algorithmic risks and harms, and through that, really better enriching the interface through which we interact with AI. Next slide, please. And introducing really the notion of informed refusal that comes out of Ruha Benjamin's work and is in parallel with the notion of informed consent, and really arguing that informed refusal and informed consent are sort of the two sides of being able to opt in as much as we opt out, and really empowering this idea of opting out as a generative stance also. Like if we are to opt out, what are we kind of creating new space for new, potentially speculative possibilities that can really enrich our experience with interacting with the AI system or generative model. Yeah, thank you. No, oh good. I think this is really where, really kind of exploring the space of contracts as a mechanism to intervene in how our data is being used and how these systems that are very much black box models, right? Like how can we have better interaction and bring in more of relationality in how we interact with these models. And really I guess the take it or leave it paradigm of the terms of service agreements, kind of transforming that into a relational contract instead of the transactional contract that it is, that doesn't really give us much option and much choice. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, Bobi, a lot of connections to explore too. All right, and finally, I'd like to invite Toshi Anders Hoo to speak. He's an award-winning filmmaker, researcher, and creative technologist whose work has been featured around the world, and he's the director of the Emerging Media Lab at the Institute for the Future. Toshi?
Thanks, Vanessa. Boy, it's so exciting to be here. As Vanessa mentioned, I do have an artistic practice of my own. I'm a filmmaker and photographer, and I like doing weird things with technology. So I moved to San Francisco 20 years ago to be part of the art and technology community. So every time I come to Gray Area, I just feel like I'm at church. But tonight I feel like I'm like in heaven. I don't know. But tonight I'm going to be speaking a little bit more from my hat as a design researcher at Institute for the Future. Could share. Let's see. Next slide. So IFTF, Institute for the Future, we are the world's longest running futures research organization. We were founded by some of the folks who helped invent the ARPANET back in the late 60s, and they started asking some questions. These are computer and social scientists saying, what if this kind of tiny 4-node networks grew out to be a global network that everybody could use? Wow, that could really change the world. Like, the future might be really different than the past. And basically, the organization has been doing that kind of work, helping the world be, not predict what's going to happen, but prepare for a range of possible futures that could happen, primarily from technological change. We have a number of different labs at IFTF, everything from the future of food, future of health, future of government. Yeah, so I'm the director of the Emerging Media Lab, and we're looking at the future of human communication, collaboration, and connection, all through the lens of emerging media technology and emerging media mythology, the stories that arise from these new technologies. Next, please. So there is about to be an elephant in many, many, many different rooms around the world. It's a generative AI. AI has been around for a long time, but there's a kind of a new flavor that's come out. Next slide, please. We've even seen art has been generated through AI. If you look on the left, this was an image generated through a GAN system just several years ago, and it was kind of cool, kind of trippy, but they all kind of looked very similar. Suddenly now we're having very, very realistic, photorealistic images and a whole range of things you can do. Next, please. We have all these different text-to-image tools, everything from DALL-E, Midjourney, and Stable Diffusion. Next slide. We're starting to see generative AI video and video effects tools. On the left is something called Runway, and on the right is Wonder Studio. These are tools that allow you basically on your desktop to do things that took studios millions of dollars and dozens of people to do. You can now do on your own. Next slide, please. We're starting to see text to 3D, just describing 3D objects and 3D worlds, which has huge implications for what Evo was talking about, world building. One of the biggest challenges for the XR world is just 3D content creation, right? It's very difficult. Only certain people can do that skill. Well, now we're all getting kind of this spell casting ability where we're going to be able to encant and describe and these 3D objects and worlds. Next slide, please. And kind of a bit of a sleeper, although we're seeing more about this, is more text to music. Turns out the music industry has a lot more lawyers than most artists, so they're a little bit more protective. But what's being done behind closed doors, like with Google's Music LM, is quite amazing. If you check out Music LM, there's some incredible demos of just describing music and then hearing. It sounds a little underwater, but it's quite on point of what you described. Next slide, please. And of course, ChatGPT, these large language models that Evo mentioned, these are very good at writing very human-like language, poems, essays, rap songs. Next slide. Increasingly, it's not going to be just very human-like writing, but we're going to see a lot of synthetic humans in our lives. Probably a lot of, well, we're already starting to see synthetic celebrities. Very quickly, you're going to start to see synthetic versions of people you know. Loved ones even, and you're going to start to experience probably synthetic versions of yourself. It's going to get quite trippy. Next slide. So I did want to share, I wouldn't classify a lot of the work I've done in the last year as art. It's more under the umbrella of design research. This is really a methodology of really trying to understand these tools by trying to create with them. But it's much more experimental in that sense. Next slide, please. So one of the things we're doing is we're using these large language models at IFTF right now to see, can we replace ourselves? And we are building scenario bots right now. This is something we actually just launched today. This is live on our website if you want to go play with it. But essentially, these are human-created forecasts that you can have a conversation with and expand out these forecasts and imagine those worlds in more detail. And this is a big part of futures work, is not just creating kind of broad statements about those worlds, is how do you make those worlds come alive? You know, reason why people like like science fiction so much is the artistry and the detail and the storytelling help us imagine what it's like to live in those worlds. And when we can imagine living in those worlds, that's when we can have better decisions and understand what the implications of our decisions are in those worlds. Next slide. Also, I'm generating a lot of art for my presentations. I had a lot of fun generating elephants in rooms, in different kinds of rooms around the world. Next slide. I've been playing a lot with video. You can see a little video of me up in the left-hand corner there, and this is an example of one of the capabilities of Runway ML. So I load a video of myself waving at the camera. I pull up a photo of a claymation, and suddenly it's not a video here, but suddenly I'm in claymation within 30 seconds. Another one. Did some light painting, so I wanted to see what it would be like to combine myself with light painting. Next. This is me combining with John Singer Sargent. My mom's a watercolor artist. It's quite trippy as a video. This is me and my colleague, so I blended ourselves together. Next slide. This is me. This is a text prompt, a face made of fruits and vegetables. It's quite compelling as a video. You can see me as fruits and vegetables. Next. You may have heard that these large language models are actually quite good at developing code. They're not perfect, but it's surprising what it can do for somebody who's not a coder. I'm not a coder. I had a friend of mine, Andreas Amador, who does this incredible land art work. You may have seen his work down at Ocean Beach with rakes. Those are like, 100 yards wide. He does these massive patterns that get washed away by the tide. He's been doing this for years. He travels the world doing this work. And he called me up and he said, could I basically just do this on a napkin. Could I do this with code? And I said, well, there's all these, you could probably hire a creative coder, and there's definitely I don't really know how to use processing, but you could do it. And I said, wait a minute. And I spent 10 minutes the first paragraph up there I described into ChatGPT. I didn't even load an image. I just said kind of described how I saw the pattern, and you can see on the right, it did a pretty good job of generating that in 15 minutes. So really exciting, particularly for the technology art community, right, is there's been a major barrier. There's often really folks with incredible creative ideas who lack the technical capability to write code. And that's one of the ways to think about these tools is that they're incredible translators. And right now we're starting to see traditionally, especially computers have been, it's been a very kind of specialized elite class who's able to interact with these technologies because computers speak computer language. Now they're starting to speak human language, right? And so they can, I'll be cautious in saying the word understand, but they kind of understand what we're saying, like I described here, and they're able to express things. And when we talk about large language models, we're not just talking about text. This is images and video, the broad definition of language. And what's interesting about language is that, language isn't just words, isn't just communication. Language is the operating system for all of humanity. Our personal lives, our professional lives, our political lives are initiated, negotiated, iterated through language, and we're about to deploy machine intelligence into all of these systems in the world's biggest technology experiment that has ever been conducted over this next year. So next slide. Oh, I did want to feature a work in this room. I'm sure there's already artists working on art, AI art, but a good friend of ours, Michael Daigle, does some incredible work with Midjourney. I think is a great example. A lot of people say, you just write some words into Midjourney, you get incredible art. He's a great example of somebody who's really elevating this and taking this to another level, and he's kind of been pushing and coining. I don't think he invented the word, but he's been kind of pushing it forth. This idea of synthographer. If you could just go to the next slide. Oh, sorry. This is an example of some of his work. He's created this whole website on Instagram, Alien Portraits, and it's kind of speculative fiction about all these different alien races that he's created. But he not only creates the image, he creates a whole backstory in describing who they are and how they relate. You've seen his work. Next slide. But he's been really pushing forth this idea of synthographies, saying it's this new art form for creating and editing images, and let's synthetically, instead of calling it just AI art, like a horseless carriage, let's give it a new name, right? So synthography is like photography. Both are art forms that anyone can make with a button press, yet both require skill, discernment, patience, and editing to master the art form. Next slide. Many artists are embracing AI. Any artists in this room embracing AI? Raise your hand. Okay, I wouldn't be surprised. Yep. But we're also seeing pushback, all right? So this is a, very complicated can of worms. It's not just an elephant. There's a can of worms with every elephant. Next slide. So we're seeing pushback. We're seeing artists submitting art into competitions generated and winning those competitions and creating great controversy. We're seeing the Copyright Office saying that this is kind of work, you can only copyright work that's been created by a human. And now they're hedging on that. Oh, well, maybe if you've modified it a certain amount, then you can copyright it. Next slide. We see some artists really embracing this. Peter Gabriel is working with the Runway folks to actually run a competition for you to do generative video that is going to be showing up in his new concert tour. And Grimes, you may have seen, is like encouraging people to train on her voice and create a synthetic version of her voice, and is willing to split the royalties on any work that you create with a synthetic version of her. Next slide. I saw this just today, this last week. So one of the big controversies, especially for the artistic community, is, so how does Midjourney work? How do all these text-to-image systems work? Well, they've been trained on literally thousands, if not millions, of images, and a lot of that work is artists. It's a hot debate. I'm sure we might even get that tonight. But Japan just this week announced that they've decided that copyright doesn't apply to AI training, meaning they will not enforce copyright on works that have been included in training data sets. So we're starting to see kind of uneven policy and enforcement, and some folks are saying, oh, well, perhaps this is more of a kind of collectivist view of collective consciousness. That's one way to look at some of these kind of models, although it's not consensual. But other folks say, well, this is just really a competitive way for them to get ahead. Well, we're going to pool all of our resources and we're going to step ahead in the world. So there's a lot of complexities to the regulation and the ethics around all of this. Next slide. Yeah, so right now, notice I say, what futures does this Gen AI make possible? My head is spinning every day, because there's so much new information. Next slide. Because it's going to be in everything, everywhere, all at once. Literally, you don't have to adopt this like a VR headset. This is going to be in your email. It's going to be in your PowerPoint. It's going to be in every design tool. Let me just say, it's only going to be in things that use words or images, which is, of course, everything. All right, so will it work well in all those cases? Well, we're going to see. I think we're going to be very surprised where it fails, and we're going to be very surprised where it succeeds. But like I said, we're about to run this massive experiment. I think last slide. Oh, and just one other point I want to make. If you get in conversations, and we'll probably get into this today, there's a lot of debate. Right? And part of this is because this is a huge phenomenon that's being released into different situations and environments and domains. And this is a non-deterministic, emergent technology that behaves differently in every setting. So you get a lot of arguments. People say, no, this is one thing, it's another thing. We're all only able to kind of discern what this is from our touch point. So keep that in mind when you're talking to people. If you find yourself in disagreement, rather than say, no, well, maybe who's right, am I right or you're right, to try to understand what's the context. And I think this is really important, as the slide I include in all my talks right now, for people, because there's a lot of arguments. It's this, it's that. A lot of people say it's not even an elephant, it's a stochastic parrot. So, I'll end on that just to say I hope we have some debate and some heated perspectives on whether or not this is a pointy tusk or a stinky tail. Thank you.
Thank you, Toshi. So much to unpack in everything that you've all said. There's a couple of strands, I think, that are continuous and really generative that we might follow in the conversation to come. So two major pieces are language and the role of language in AI and in the kind of sociality around AI. You talked about language as like the crux and the kind of glue of sociality. Toshi, you've talked about language and the terms that we serve with. Language and prompt craft, language as a kind of spell casting. So I invite you to think a little bit more about the role of language in this new era. How should we think about language? Are there kind of existing models to lean back on? Are there ways that we should be rethinking language and text? Is the language itself a kind of creative paradigm? anyone may jump in.
Is language itself a creative paradigm? That's a really interesting question. I work as a prompt engineer by trade right now. And when people ask me what is a prompt engineer, I tell them I'm a language engineer. I go through every specific word to understand what it means to these wide variety of tools. And then I am trying to, it's not even ascertain or understand, it's more like extrapolate how it's making those connections and be able to repeat that pattern over and over again. One example is the difference between dreamy and dreamlike. And if you are someone who's tried different AI tools, ask for something in a dreamy state and ask for something in a dreamlike state. They are very different. And we as humans don't necessarily pick up on that. But if you ask Midjourney, dreamy is something like this art piece, right? This very sort of ephemeral, beautiful, like a dreamy experience. Dreamlike is surrealism. It might be me naked up here right now, right? Very different experiences. And because you and I use language differently all over the world, we don't necessarily know what those nuances are until we experiment over and over and over again. That's what prompt engineering is. That's the fine-tuning of language to get on the same page about what it means to be in the dream together.
Ooh, I'd love to pick up on that line of being in the dream together, also from the lens of predominantly, of course, English is the language that is used in these models, right? And the challenges around that, right? Like, what is a non-Western view on how we interact with these models? And I mean, very personally for me, when my parents from Bulgaria asked me about ChatGPT and talked to me about it, I was like, do not use this, because it's like literally when you talk to it in Cyrillic, right, and in Bulgarian language, which is very close to Russian language, like you end up at a very different part of the internet that is a very different part of experience, right? As versus like this sort of English-speaking experience, and of course also within English language as well. There are like so many nuances. But yeah, what happens with how do we think about these systems in terms of like a non-Western view as well, and how do we expand who gets to participate, right? And kinds of empowering like non-English-speaking communities, like and people, right, to design and develop their own language models, right, and other systems, right, through their own lens. And it brings up also this theory of linguistic relativity by Tim Worth, which talks about how people think differently when they speak different languages, and really the nuance, right, about what you said. Yeah.
Yeah, language is so key to this. When I first started just kind of trying to wrap my own head around, particularly the large language models, you know, I had my last November, November 20th, what I had been a bit of an AI skeptic before, and we'd even used GPT-3 for a number of different projects. But when ChatGPT came out, had that classic like up all night, like, okay, we're in a new world. And it was clear, it was a big part of this was that it was a language model. And there's so many aspects to it. I'm glad you picked up on that, Vanessa. Number one, first thing I did is I just kind of put it out to my circles online, like what's your definition of language? And I got so many different ones, but my favorite one was language is our human technology for projecting our models from our head into other people's minds. And I really liked that, and I thought about that for a while. And then I also contacted my cousin who's a linguist, and I just wanted to talk to her about, because I was also thinking like, okay, part of what's happening is that these systems are really kind of learning human language in a new way. Again, both reading and writing. And so I wanted to understand specifically, like, I was very curious, like, what happens when cultures kind of come together? I kept thinking about the golden record out on Voyager, like imagining an alien race, like finding that golden record, right? And the golden record has like all these like artifacts and bits of human culture, and imagining that be like their training data set, and they were coming to the America, I'm so US-centric, the Earth, and sorry about that. United States is the world. And coming to the world and trying to communicate with us. So what happens when one culture meets another culture, and those are mythical tales here in America, sorry, can't fixate on that, like, colonists coming to America trying to learn languages, and what happens in those situations. And when I talked to my cousin, she said, I found out, I didn't even know this, that her specialty is meta-linguistics, which is all of the things we're communicating aside from the information. And so one of the big things about, one of the big studies of metalinguistics is that often when we're communicating, a big part of human communication is communicating who's in the in-group and who's in the out-group. And I thought about that for quite a bit of time because, in a way, it's very clear that there's a lot of really interesting capabilities, but I think part of what's stirring everybody up is that there's a lot of really interesting politics that are coming up right now. And that's why we have people arguing, like I alluded to stochastic parrots. There's a number of people who believe we shouldn't even be calling this intelligence, that this is merely just probable, statistical math trained on data, and it's just predicting the very next word. And not only are they kind of trying to kind of demystify it, but there's a political argument there saying, like, we shouldn't be giving this power. And one of the things that I think that I often try to kind of bring it around to is, like, right now, most of people's touch points, the way they're grabbing the elephant, has been ChatGPT or maybe Midjourney. And their experience of that is, just interacting and experiencing answers and advice, right? The most it can do is just kind of provide language to you. What's about to happen is we're about to experience it move from just language and information, and advice to taking action and having agency. And that's where the big questions of power come into play. And again, as I said, language is the operating system for all human systems, basically. So where, how is language going to be used for power? Is one of the big questions. We already know it. It's already used for that.
Yeah, and speech acts are performances. Think of when you go to a wedding and the person marrying you says, "I do." You're married, right? Like, there's action embedded in these speech acts too. There's a way in which that language is twofold, right? Think about prompt engineering. You are also being trained to speak in a particular way. And I think this kind of question about language, I'm trying to surface the duality of this training process here, right? They are trained on our archives, our images, our text, but we get more of what we want when we are trained to create the paragraphs and the text that, give us the outcomes that we want. So that's, I think, kind of part of this shaping, I think, that you're talking about, Toshi.
Yeah, and I think, it's always really important to remember, like ChatGPT, this is trained on not all human knowledge or all human language. It's trained from a certain set of data scraped from the internet, which is a certain type of human language, and certain type of people have had the privilege of publishing and have access to that. I've been more fascinated, how can we expand out the kind of things that we include as data? There's some things that just are really difficult to encode into data. Reading a really cool book right now called Ways of Being, that's written by a machine learning developer who's saying, like, if we're going to be using these systems to kind of reimagine the world and help us ideally move forward into the future, right now we're taking it by just defining it as language, which is by definition human language. We're going to be building systems that are only based on human observations, human ways of thinking. How could we interject other types of data, non-human? What he says is, and he's quoting someone else, the more than human world. So it's really exciting for us because we all speak human language, but I think as we realize how prevalent and how much agency and how much this is going to shape the future of not just humans, but our existence in this bigger, more than human world, how can we add in and include those kinds of data and other kinds of languages that are non-human?
Embedded in what you're saying, and I think across all your talks too, are different visions of sociality and relationality, right? You've used the word symbiosis in talking about how you learn how to dance with an AI. Terms We Serve With is about service and community and each other. You also had an embodied community project, Toshi. So how might you describe some of the existing kind of social worlds that are fueling the imagination of AI right now, and what's possible? Like, what are the worlds we want to create, and the social worlds we want to create in the future to come with AI?
I'm interested in more interconnectedness, less dualism, more sense of wholeness, less isolation, more celebration of what is beautifully human and what is beautifully alive. How do we create worlds that are beneficial to all of human life, right? To the multi-perspectival, not just the anthropomorphic, but to all things that live on this planet. How can we create that beauty together? And there is a sort of call and feedback response pattern. Like we're learning to sense how to flow with these things, and it is a very almost magical quality because it's elemental. As you pointed to that in your sort of first experience with GPT-3 and feeling like you were kind of going down into this rabbit hole of a whole new world, a new paradigm. So I see a lot of folks right now pulling from the last 50 years, which is relatively dystopian, us versus them, dualism, all of our movies, right? There's a good guy and a bad guy. And the world isn't necessarily like that, right? So our training models for the last 50 years of media are bad, right? They're training us to see each other as enemies. That's a bad training set. So I'm interested in what happens beyond that, which is humanness, but also interconnectedness, and also embracing what is beautiful about all of those transmissions that are flowing between us.
Yeah, thank you. Just got me thinking a lot, even just being in this space and just seeing how the artwork around us really is part of the experience of being here, and it really changes the experience of talking about this even. And really the way that technology as a medium, right, is changing our experiences. And for me, I love also the sort of your question also leaning into this, what are different kinds of futures we can imagine beyond what we have right now, and really the role of art and artists really to help bring awareness about some of the challenges that we have currently, which really also opens up new space for how could things be different, and what are alternative models, and what are ways to better bring in this sort of community-driven participatory means to engage more people in defining this kind of new alternative power structures, perhaps, right, with how this technology is being created and who gets to participate and who really agency, right, and what is that going to look like in the future, and kind of having a more of a collective sense and of agency too, on like the individual and the collective level, and really using art as a medium to explore those spaces.
I mentioned earlier the ML is interested not just in media technology, but also media mythologies. And I really think of mythology. I mean, he with the hammer sees everything as nail. I'm a storyteller, so I see everything as story. And been very interested, particularly in the last year, and I just gave a talk at a speculative futures conference on what I'm seeing as a new archetype rising up, a new archetype for storytelling, rising up not just in the fringe, but also within mainstream popular culture, and that is the archetype of the multiverse. And if just a couple of years ago, if you had said the word multiverse, you most likely would have been talking about more of like a quantum physics or mathematical multiverse. What excites me right now, I'm less excited about like an equation that can prove there's a parallel universe somewhere else. I'm more interested in kind of the cultural, sociocultural multiverse that is very kind of evident just through all of our own experiences, which is we're all living in our own universe. And the interesting patterns that I've kind of been noticing in pop culture media is because there's always been like kind of like, oh, alternative world. Previously it's been, let's go to that weird world and let's come back. What we're seeing right now, everything everywhere all at once being kind of like the prime example of this, but you're seeing it also in the Marvel movies as well, is there's stories of integration. It's overlapping universes. How do we integrate the diversity of experience, the diversity of perspective. And so I very much believe that humanity is kind of like conjures up new forms of story and new patterns. So, if you see mythology, it's kind of in the Campbell view of like, these are maps of relationships. They're relational maps. Our relationship to ourselves, our relationship to each other, our relationship to our environment and our context, and our relationship to the unknown and the unknowable. And we search for these kind of stories to do this. And so I'm very excited because I see this emerging out, and I don't think it's any coincidence that these multiversal stories are coming up right now, these archetypes, in a time where we're being given this technology that's in, one way to describe these large models is these are like collective consciousness mirrors. And, it's funny when you see people like talking about how biased they are or how how much they make up things. And it's like, what does that remind you of? Humans, right? So this is an opportunity for us to kind of face that and understand ourselves and each other in new ways. And there's the darker sides as well, like the madness of the multiverse, the Doctor Strange movie. Like, this is overwhelming, right? This is overwhelming to try to integrate so many different perspectives, so many different stories, and many different realities. But I see it as a moment, like, because simultaneously we're also in the moment where we're recognizing like a neurodiversity, like, oh, maybe there is no neuronormative, right? Maybe it's not even just a spectrum. Maybe everybody's kind of weird, and some people are more neuroconformist, right? And they just are easy. It's easier for them to do that. So I see all of these things connected. We're being given these new tools to kind of, I see media as a big reflection and a mirror at a time where I think we're being faced with big challenges of how do we integrate diversity of perspectives and experiences. We're being faced with environmental challenges that can't be won by beating them. The classic model of the narrative is always like the bad, the good guy beats or destroys or banishes the bad guy. I mean, literally, if you go and see, what is it, Spider-Man No Way Home, like the whole story is him trying to integrate versions of himself to save and heal the bad guys. Like, literally, like the moment of the film where like his Mary Jane, his girlfriend, says, "Let's go kick some ass," and Spider-Man leans in and goes, "No, let's go heal some ass." And like, I'm like, this is, it sounds a little corny, but they pull it off, and this is not just one example. Like, this is happening, and you can see lots of examples, and it's not just happening on its own. Like, you can listen to a lot of the filmmakers and writers who are creating this. There's a consciousness around this. So I see AI tied into all of this as like, this is just yet another tool for us to figure out how we can have better integration.
I'm working on an AI film right now called White Mirror with 10 filmmakers from around the world. And we see very similarly this multi-perspectival storytelling becoming the norm, right? Being able to reflect diversity of experiences, imaginations, and being able to bring those together in a singular narrative while still being multi-perspectival, being sort of everything, everywhere, all at once, but interoperable and together and not separate. And that is a relatively new movement in media, you're right. It's happening only since the pandemic, I think, last 5 years, where we've really seen this convergence, and we are striving for that sense of like, well, how does it all fit together? Because we understand that we aren't separate from each other. We understand that our experiences aren't completely separate from each other, but it is often hard to see and empathize and really feel ourselves in each other's shoes until we have those visceral experiences. AI is giving us all sorts of new visceral experiences, right? It's giving me the way of hearing my cipher, right? Hearing a version of my voice that is generated that isn't me, but is me. I sound like a sort of militant version of myself in a song that is disturbing to me, right? Making art of my own voice and my own lyrics that disturbs me is something that I'm having a very new relationship with, right? My art freaking me out. And still feeling like I can publish it, but I have to be ready for the backlash of publishing it too, because just because I understand my experience doesn't mean that everyone else is going to understand that experience too.
Yeah, thank you for that. Toshi, I like what you were saying about collective unconsciousness. There's a way that the tools that our AI tools are being used allow us to parse archives that we just can't. I mean, I can't look at millions of images. I cannot read the entire internet. So there's a kind of distillation there that is really compelling and profound. And you're right, can kind of ask us to reposition ourselves and how we think about ourselves in relation to each other. How, and so much of the stances that artists are taking are defensive, like, and rightly so. You know, my work is being scraped. I not get any credit. How should I position myself in relation to this? Given this new paradigm and this kind of thinking about this as a response to a collective unconsciousness, how should artists be thinking about creativity, originality, relationality, and their kind of creative practices?
Maybe I can start on that with really this work around the terms we serve with agreement that I was sharing about, because really at the heart of it is a stakeholder engagement process that is very much comes from this field of feminist science and technology studies, and really engages people that are really either building the systems themselves or building involved in the different part of the pipeline, from like the data curation, labeling, training, evaluation, audit, and ultimately, hopefully, the sunsetting, right, of some kind of models as well, right? Which I think we don't often speak enough about, like sort of when do models die, right? And what does that mean, right? And like who decides that, right? And like how we really think if they are going to really redefine what does it mean to relate to each other and to relate to, I love how you phrase it, the unknown and the unknowable. I think because currently they're built by a very privileged part of the world, right? I think oftentimes we don't realize our own human biases, right? And recognizing that is perhaps hopefully the first step to recognizing that, yeah, people are different and they're going to engage differently with this technology. And really through this participatory mechanisms, my hope was that we can better talk about these issues and really embed that in the way that we had this underlying, perhaps new accountability mechanisms that are going to emerge through some form of like open source licensing or different kinds of schemes to help protect artists and other creators in different ways, right? And perhaps they're going to be also in different parts of the pipeline of these tools and the way we engage with them with creative work. But really to support better human agency, right, over the way that we create.
I will say to all of you, if you are seeking to create your own voices and body of work in this space, the biggest thing I can tell you to stop doing is prompting people's names. Take other people's names out of your prompts, period. Don't use other people's IP. You don't have to. Develop your own language, right? Get clear about what your vision is and create language for it that isn't about other people's work, that is about your vision.
I'm kind of several minds on this. Just having being an artist and having many friends who are artists and knowing the struggle of artists and being a struggling artist myself at many times in my life. You know, when these systems first came out and the world was like super excited about it, of course I felt very emotional. I was like, okay, this is clearly theft, right? I mean, this is non-consensual. This is exactly how it's being done. Yes, it's maybe not the same as sampling. It's a little bit different. But it just felt wrong to me. And I think there's a lot of, and also, I mean, one of the elements of all of this, it's not just going to be everywhere, in everything, everywhere, all at once. It's the speed of change, of deployment this is happening. So society can't respond, and because we're going to have to respond to so many different questions at the same time, we're not able to kind of have that natural like response and discussion about, okay, is this right or wrong? And of course, like the biggest companies that happen to be technology companies in the world are basically betting their future fortune on this right now. So there's this kind of So this leads me back to this thought. Ted Chiang is one of my favorite science fiction writers. He writes a lot about AI, and he was interviewed in New York Times a couple months ago, and he said, I think a lot of people's fear about AI and really technology in general is more about what capitalism is going to do to us with that, and of course I want my friends who are artists to be able to make a living, but I think, working at the Institute for the Future, we're often looking at, looking back to your slide, Bobi, of the iceberg, right? How do we look at this in kind of deeper embedded systems? So it's easy to be like, no, wrong, don't steal from artists, and I don't disagree with that, but we're also kind of like, okay, this is more, a bigger question about why are artists so vulnerable in society and don't have a place exist in that way. And I will also say, artists are the canary in the coal mine, right? This is not just going to be artists, right? People thought automation was only going to impact, and for several years it's been the case, only low skill work. All the research shows right now this is about to impact high-paid, creative work with people with college degrees. Now, that's different and interesting. Also, those people tend to have a lot more political power and sway and agency in their lives. So I think there's going to be some interesting things that result from that. I'll just stop there.
That seems like a good moment maybe to turn things over to the audience. If anyone has any questions that they would like to ask.
I'm very curious to hear from this audience.
Where to begin? Why don't we start here? Oh, sure.
Run around. Who was it? Barney?
Hi, this was super good. Really enjoyed all the perspectives and comments. So I'll give you guys an easy question. In 10 years, how do you see the human condition having changed?
Oh, that's the easy question?
Yeah.
There are so many different reality camps. Do you live in the Google reality? Do you live in, if you think of every model today as forming a version of its own reality, the same way, 20 years ago we were divided by our technologies by are you an Apple or an Android user, or these kinds of things. Which reality you live in might be dictated in part by the models and the tools you choose to engage with, right? So I'm an Adobe user, therefore they get to determine some portion of what is real for me. And that's a very scary proposition for many, many of us to figure out how do you then sort of hold what is my reality? How do I then re-grasp reality for myself and not have it be intermediated by a handful of companies? So I think that's the biggest battle we're about to face for the next decade.
So this is our bread and butter at IFTF is 10-year forecasts, right? We typically do these long-term forecasts. And I'll be really honest with you, this is a curveball, even for IFTF. The amount of change that's about to happen is, we're at an inflection point. And the range of places and the speed that it's going to happen is mind-boggling, to be honest. I worked for Ray Kurzweil for about 10 years. I actually don't ascribe to all his predictions about the future, but I will say to you, in the last 3 months, I've woken up saying, this is what exponential change feels like. Now, to your point earlier, Evo, you were talking about how much our society has so what's our training data set? So how do we predict what is potentially going to happen? Our training data set is filled with dystopian stories of fear, and and there's reasons for that, right? I mean, we want to encode dangerous things so that we know how to move forward in the world. I like to say, people forget that stories are a technology. They're a survival technology. They're not an entertainment technology. They're survival technology. Before times, not before COVID, but before media, the stories that you heard were the people that lived. And now we're able to create stories from people that aren't thriving or aren't even real, right? So I say all of this to say that we really don't know, and it's getting really crazy. What I will say is the things that give me a lot of hope is just recognizing that our training data set is biased towards like dystopian things. Our human minds are literally wired not only to project the past into the future, but to emphasize, I think we just heard a study, my wife just sent me a study the other day, 2.5 times more likely to remember negative things and positive things, which makes sense, right? We need to avoid, like it's great to enjoy something, but you definitely don't want to get eaten by the lion, right? So, but the things that kind of give me curiosity, and by the way, I hate the term futurist because it just sounds like you know what's going to happen. I prefer future curious. And the things that keep me curious and hopeful about the future is that how emergent this technology is. We're about to see all these big companies try to use it to do capitalism on us, but they can't control it. I mean, literally, look at Google. Google, the leading company that's about to do this, is coming forth to tell the world that they are going to own this future, and literally the first thing they put out in the world is like an error. So number one, it's emergent. Number two, all these technologies are being deployed within human systems, which have their own flaws. And then the other hopeful things are, just like there's a lot of folks that say like that this is actually going to disrupt the big incumbent players in the world, right? There's a lot of interesting research. Most people are familiar with the big models right now, GPT and these things. People are building small models. It took, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not a researcher like Bobi, but it took the way we got to where we are in this last push in why we are seeing this surge of capability is by scale. Like the big companies went in and had all the data and like literally tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars worth of computing power to just say like, what if we just put all the data in and then looked at it, and they did have some special new techniques called transformer models that are able to identify more complexity. Am I saying all this right? Yes, good. And they were able to do that, but that was to prove the concept. And that there's a lot of really interesting research showing right now that smaller models actually can be more efficient. There's examples I've read of like folks building large models and then randomly turning off half of the neurons in these neural nets, which is the basic, and finding they're more efficient. So there's this huge, that when I said the unknown and the unknowable, there's a lot of unknowables. You may have seen like Geoffrey Hinton, not only the lead at Google's AI, but he's literally invented a lot of this technology that has enabled these large language models and these transformer models. He left Google to be able to speak more freely about this stuff, but the point is the people that created it don't know what it's going to do. And the big story that I see is happening right now is it's leaving the lab where they already didn't fully understand what it's going to do, and it's moving into the world, which could have very catastrophic things, also could have some pretty interesting, cool things, I think, that we don't intend to have happen.
Yeah. No, let's leave it at that. More questions. That's fantastic. Thank you. Yeah.
I'll take the futurist questions.
This is a real basic question. I think it's about training and how much of and to say the internet is not all knowledge. And there is good information and bad information, and someone has to decide what that is. How is that happening today? How is this managed, if it is? Where the data comes from and all the data that's not in the internet.
Maybe I'll start. That's like a fascinating question that's really top of mind for a lot of people in the technology, in the civil society space, in the sort of investigative journalism and policy makers, right? Because there's a lot of issues around the lack of transparency around data, right? And what is used as training data. And to be completely honest with you, when I was working in machine learning development at a big tech company, we literally, the kind of data that we needed didn't exist. So we needed to collect it ourselves. And they didn't even want to pay another company that is very, sort of, they didn't want to pay people that are like, trained to work with this kind of data like that we needed, because they were worried about IP, like they were worried about really somebody else, like the competition model right behind the technology. So I think a lot of times the companies are worried about like these incentive structures that are underlying their decision making, right, currently are really not as aligned as we want them to be with our goals as artists or creators, right? And there's a lot of friction there, right now. But to me, what gives me curiosity is really this kind of participatory means to engage with people, to bring more awareness about the lack of transparency that can really create more tension, both including within sort of internal actors inside of the tech companies. We're seeing a growing number of trust and safety teams at all of the companies that you were mentioning already, and really companies doing a lot of thinking around algorithmic auditing and like how are we thinking about all the risks and challenges, and of course they're very much related to data. So hopefully we'll be seeing more and more in that space. Yeah, thank you.
Hi. First of all, thanks a lot for that interesting discussion tonight. Question. I was thinking about if that's the end of language. Just to make kind of another point, I think we live in a world right now we are well connected. I think the whole world is connected. I think it was never this way before. The other thing, we have language. We can talk to each other. But looking back, what machine learning brought us was less communication, meaning like looking at the last 10 years with social networks, we have those echo chambers. So the machine learning system introduces us to similar-minded thinking people. Like that's something we have seen. With ChatGPT now, we now start to communicate by having ChatGPT generate emails to our friends, to other people. So now we add this thing in between that now normalizes language in one way or the other. And then we spoke about now someone using this one to generate art. So we now get flooded by thousands of pictures and thousands of things. So it feels like right now we are less connected, even so we have everything. So do you think it's a problem? And secondly, do you think we have to generate, or not generate, but produce a new language, a new way to communicate on a more personal way?
I want to say it may be simplifying how we use language and altering, for example, if you look at emoji use over the last 10 years, a single emoji can express a whole paragraph for someone. And if you put an emoji into Midjourney, it's a fascinating experiment to put a whole bunch of different emoji into Midjourney and see how those come out. So yes, language is evolving. Using prompts, for example, we are finding it works better if you reduce every word but the most essential. So brevity matters. And we're here talking over and over and over again, but I think it may change how we talk to each other, maybe using fewer words, but more meaningful ones.
The other side here, mate? Okay.
Thank you. How are all these things doing with humor?
Terribly. That has been part of my job, and I got to say, terribly overall. We said GPT-3 was like talking to a sixth grader, GPT-4 like a high schooler. I consider GPT-4 currently like a junior SNL intern at best. It can repeat Monty Python, so like if you give it a pattern, it can follow a pattern. It doesn't understand what is humor. At a fundamental level, it only understands how to repeat a pattern. So if you can teach it how to write a dad joke, good luck.
And last question here.
Hi, so my question is around, just thinking of how to phrase it, but basically, I think a lot of the systems are looking for more data, but when I think about data, I think about inclusion into what. There was like an article about how a lot of the image generators put out, if you ask them for different image generation, it's like the American smile. So it puts kind of, I guess basically one sort of cultural language and stuff like that. So one thing I'd like to kind of ask is maybe your thoughts on or maybe more of like a speculation of what you might imagine for a future that isn't just maybe colonialist and capitalist in terms of systems and data sets, and like just speculating 10 years in the future, like what that might look like, or whatever amount of time in the future you'd like to imagine.
Just briefly, I'll just say what I was alluding to earlier about right now we're seeing kind of incumbents and big companies building these models, and it takes a massive scale to do it. That isn't necessarily going to be the case for very long. People are going to start training their own models. I think 3 weeks ago, Google had a famous memo that leaked that said, "We have no moat," in which their development team said, "Look, this is like the cat's out of the bag. Yeah, we have scale. Yes, we have all these things, but people know how to do this now." And so what we're going to start to see is people training models on their own data at different scales. So I think right now it's very dominated by the corporate interests that are choosing the data that they're choosing, and OpenAI isn't even telling us what data is what's in their data set at this point. I think we're going to see individuals training. We're already seeing individuals training their own models, seeing organizations training their own models. I believe we're going to see public models. Sam Altman, initially created OpenAI to, with the manifesto, like we're doing this to not have profit motive, and then somehow got $13 billion from Microsoft, and he was on the hard fork, not hard fork, it was at Kara Swisher's podcast, and she took him to task and said, like, look, this your manifesto is still on your website. Like, why did you take this money? He's like, well, it's the only way we could afford to do this. And she said, well, isn't there any other way? And he said, well, yeah, 30 years ago, the government would have done this. $13 billion sounds like a lot of money, not for a tool that the entire world can use. So I think that as now the world knows this is possible, and we're going to see lots of different organizations doing this. We're going to see lots of different ways of governance and transparency, and all these things are being called out. And I don't believe that this is going to be just held by the incumbent big technology companies. I'd be curious to hear what you guys think.
And open source is eating corporate lunch right now. If you look at large language models, there are teams building extremely effective large language models for thousands of dollars instead of billions of dollars. So there is a bifurcation happening. Not everyone's going the corporate route. Lots of folks are thinking about not just open source on the model side, but thinking about more broadly open sourcing how they're doing the work. To your point about colonialism, I think there's a lot of pushback that needs to continually happen across the industry with creatives, with artists. For example, I had some conversations with the team at Midjourney because I was offended over and over and over again in testing their tools. And I said, listen, you've trained this on size 2 models. This isn't appropriate. It causes a sort of dysmorphic response when I look at an image of myself and you give me a size 2 body and I'm a size 12. So tool makers, even in 6 months, Midjourney was able to address that. So I think it's much more like a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year versus a 10-year frame. But the more each of you as creatives experiment and test a tool and then go back to that company and say, you need to do better about this, they improve and they listen and they will come back to you really fast.
And beautifully building on that, yeah, for me is also collective action and organizing, right? And hopefully that becoming easier and easier, and we have better tools that support people to have this on the individual, on the collective level, and hold those companies accountable, right? And really come at creating better feedback loops and faster feedback loops, right? Because of the development of technology so fast, and really including non-Western worldviews in those kind of feedback loops with the people building the technology, people using it, and really improving that level of transparency and accountability. But ultimately, my sort of secret wish in the speculative 10-year sort of fiction domain is thinking about a world where we have all of this technology really better aligned with a psychology of care and service, and really helping us to reflect and really reflect on what is it really, like, why are we doing this, like why are we using this technology, or like what is really the bigger sort of those bigger questions that perhaps we are sort of our frictionless worlds, right? Like don't want us to ask because of the pace at which everything is happening, but like what is it to like slow down, right? What is this sort of politics of refusal or really, embedding our own values into this?
I'm going to encourage you to go read Bobi's Terms We Serve With, and specifically thinking about mutuality and how we show up in mutual care and respect for each other and building products, art, communities that reflect that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Round of applause for all our.